walked through the front door of that house 1,000 times, and 1,000 times the air inside felt wrong. Not wrong like a storm coming, wrong like a language you never learned but were expected to speak fluently. The lights were on. The television hummed. Someone was in the kitchen, and yet the moment your back pressed against that door and the latch clicked behind you, the loneliness hit you like a wave that had no shore. You stood in the middle of your own home and felt the particular anguish of a soul who has nowhere left to go, because the place that was supposed to be the answer was also somehow the source of the wound. You unpacked your exhaustion in silence. You carried the weight of the day up a staircase that nobody watched you climb. That detail, nobody watching you climb, is something I need you to sit with, because that detail contains the entire story. There was a dinner table. Maybe there still is. And at that table, your family gathered the way families are supposed to gather. Bodies present, voices filling the room, plates passed, and stories exchanged. And you sat in the middle of it, like a ghost who had not yet been told it was dead. You laughed at the right moments. You reached for the bread. You answered the questions asked of you in that polite, surface-level way that keeps the peace and costs you everything. But underneath the performance, your chest was doing something that chests do when the soul is screaming at a volume the throat refuses to carry. It was tightening. It was collapsing inward on itself like a star before it either explodes or disappears. Nobody at that table saw it, not because they were cruel, but because light, when it is surrounded by surfaces that cannot reflect it, has no choice but to illuminate in silence. And then the bathroom, or maybe the shower, or maybe the car parked in a lot where nobody could find you for 7 minutes. That is where the cry finally happened. The one you had been swallowing since morning, since last week, since childhood. The water from the showerhead was not just water, it was cover. It gave your body permission to do what it had been forbidden from doing in the open. Your shoulders shook. Your face did the thing faces do when the grief is older than the moment that triggered it. You were not crying about dinner. You were crying about a lifetime of dinners. You were crying for the child who learned before the age of 10 that their interior world was not welcome at the exterior table. Your body knew what your mind had not yet found words for, that the loneliness you carried was not a personal failure. It was a spiritual signature. And that is why, in the trilogy, The 3 Keys to a Prosperous Life, the link is in the pinned comment, I explain the hidden mechanism behind this very pain. Why the ones chosen by God are almost always the ones forged first in the fire of being unseen by the very people who should have seen them clearest. Because what was happening in that home was not simply emotional distance or generational dysfunction, though both of those things were real. What was happening operated at a frequency below the surface of the visible. There is a realm that runs concurrent to this one, unseen, ancient, and deeply aware of the assignments written over human lives before those lives ever drew first breath. And in that realm, your arrival into your family line was not neutral. You did not slip in quietly. You came in carrying something that registered in the spiritual atmosphere, like a flare going off in a dark field. The darkness in that environment felt it. It perceived the weight of the anointing before you had any framework to understand what anointing even meant. And the response to that perception was not random cruelty. It was targeted resistance. You were not disliked. You were discerned by the wrong kingdom for the right reason. The scapegoating began early. You may not have called it that as a child, but your nervous system catalogued every incident with precise accuracy. You were blamed for the mood in the room when you had barely entered it. You were accused of causing tension simply by being yourself. Too quiet, too loud, too serious, too much. The emotional architecture of that household had no room in its blueprint for the kind of soul you were carrying. So the household pushed back. It redirected its unspoken pain toward the one whose sensitivity made her the most convenient target. You became the emotional landfill for a family that had never learned to process its own grief. Everyone's anxiety poured into you. Everyone's unresolved shame found a container in your open, unprotected chest, and you held it all. You held it without a manual. You held it without being asked. You held it because some part of you even then, even that small, believed that maybe if you held enough of their pain, they would finally be okay. And if they were finally okay, maybe there would finally be room for you. There was never going to be room, not because you were not enough, but because the room itself was built by hands that could not accommodate your dimensions. The family system you were born into had load-bearing walls of silence and denial that had been standing for generations before you arrived. Your grandparents passed their unspoken grief to your parents. Your parents passed what they never healed to the atmosphere you grew up in. The body keeps the score. Science now confirms what the spirit always knew. And so the collective body of your bloodline held a score written in trauma that nobody had yet been given the courage to read. You were born with the potential to read it. That potential was itself a threat. The chains that bind a family line are not broken without resistance. Every generational stronghold fights for its survival. And the one appointed to break the chain always feels the chains most acutely before the breaking begins. You were the child who sensed the lie inside the smile. You watched your parent perform contentment at the holiday gathering while the quiet devastation lived just behind their eyes. And you felt it so acutely you thought you might be going crazy. You were not going crazy. Your discernment was functioning at a level that no one around you had the language to validate. That perception, that ancient, heavy, too early awareness, isolated you from your peers as thoroughly as it isolated you from your family. Other children played with an ease that confused you. They seemed to exist inside the moment, without the moment's full weight pressing down on them. You could not do that. You sat in the classroom feeling the sadness of the teacher who smiled too brightly. You walked into rooms and immediately mapped the fractures in the energy. That was not a flaw in your wiring. That was a gift that had not yet been given its name or its assignment. You were told you were too sensitive, and you heard it so many times that eventually it sounded like a diagnosis. Eventually the accusation became a lens through which you examined yourself, always searching for the evidence that confirmed their verdict. You filtered your own reactions through their framework. You preemptively silenced yourself before they could silence you. You folded your spirit down to a smaller size to fit the space they allotted. And in doing so, you participated without knowing it in the oldest trick in the enemy's arsenal, getting the anointed to agree with the attack. But here is what the accusation always omitted. The same sensitivity that made dinner tables painful was the same sensitivity that would one day make you capable of reaching into the chest of a stranger and pulling out a buried grief they had no words for. The very thing they told you was broken was the very thing God intended to use. The photograph still exists somewhere, the one where you are smiling next to people who should have been your shelter. And if you look at it long enough, past the surface of the image, past the composed expressions and the arranged bodies, you can see it, the distance in your eyes, not sadness exactly, more like the look of someone standing at a window, watching a world they cannot quite enter, wondering if the inability to enter is their fault or the world's design. That child in the photograph deserved someone to sit beside them and say the words that never came. They deserved to be told that their strangeness was not a malfunction, that their depth was not a burden, that the reason they felt ancient in a child's body was because the assignment on their life predated the body itself. That child deserved the truth, so let me speak it now. Across every year between that photograph and this moment, you were never the problem. You were always the answer. And the war that was waged against your sense of self since childhood was proof, irrefutable, violent, consistent proof, that the enemy knew who you were before you did. He knew before the birthday parties, where you stood slightly to the side. He knew before the rejection letters and the friendships that dissolved without explanation. He knew before the relationships that started with fire and ended in ash. He knew in the delivery room. He knew in the ultrasound. He knew in the spiritual dimension before your parents had chosen your name, because assignments like yours are written in eternity before they are handed to time. The coordinated nature of the opposition in your life is not paranoia. It is pattern recognition applied to a spiritual reality that is older and more intentional than the individual incidents through which it expressed itself. You were not unlucky. You were targeted. And in the kingdom's economy, being targeted by the enemy is the most backhanded compliment in existence. You do not send warships to a harbor with nothing in it. The intensity of the warfare was a map of the treasure. Now I need you to come deeper into something that most people will not say out loud. The difference between you and the others in that room, at that table, in that family, in that circle, was not a difference in worthiness. It was a difference in frequency. There are people who are born carrying a light so concentrated, so inconvenient to the spiritual darkness embedded in their environment, that their mere presence functions as an irritant. Not because they are arrogant, not because they are loud or difficult, but because the light they carry, even when they are quiet, even when they are trying their hardest to shrink and disappear, cannot be suppressed below the threshold of spiritual perception. The people in your life who criticized you the most, who minimized you with the most creativity and consistency, were not responding to your flaws. They were responding to your flame. The darkness in them, not them, the darkness in them, reacted to the light in you the way any darkness reacts to any light. It pulled away, it attacked, it tried to extinguish. Think about Joseph. 17 years old, sleeping in his father's house, dreaming dreams that were too big for his bedroom. His brothers did not gather at the pit to throw him in because they had conducted a careful assessment of his faults. They gathered at the pit because the favor of God on his life was visible to them in a way that bypassed their reason and reached directly into the unhealed wound of comparison. They saw the coat. They saw the father's eyes when they rested on the youngest son. And something in them, something ancient and unresolved, could not tolerate the proximity of that much grace. So they did what the threatened always do to the anointed. They tried to bury the evidence. They could not. You cannot bury the evidence of God's intention. The pit only changes the terrain of the journey. It does not alter the destination. David spent years in fields that no one considered important. He was the son who was not summoned when the prophet came. His father, standing in the presence of a man of God who had come specifically to anoint the next king of Israel, did not even think to include him in the gathering. That detail should stop you cold. The one who was chosen was the one that his own father instinctively overlooked. The one who would defeat giants and write psalms and establish a lineage through which the Son of God would enter the world. That one was out in the field with the sheep because his family had already made an internal decision about his relevance. Heaven disagreed. Heaven always disagrees with the assessments made by environments that are too small to perceive what they are looking at. If your family overlooked you, if they underestimated you, if they arranged their hierarchy of importance and placed you below where you knew you belonged, understand that they were operating from the same limitation that Jesse operated from. They could only see what was in front of them. God sees what is inside you. And Jesus, if we are willing to go all the way into the truth, was not rejected by strangers. He was rejected by the people who had watched him grow up. When he returned to Nazareth, to the town where he had played as a child, where the neighbors remembered his mother's face and the smell of his father's workshop, they took offense at him. They could not reconcile the ordinary origin with the extraordinary authority. Is this not the carpenter's son? That question was not curiosity. It was a cage. It was the crowd attempting to reduce him back to the size they were comfortable with. They had decided who he was allowed to be, and his refusal to fit that definition made them furious. The most dangerous moment for any chosen one is the moment they outgrow the definition assigned by the people who knew them first. That is the moment the attacks intensify. That is also the moment the calling is confirmed. The criticism that wore the costume of advice. The concern that tasted like contempt. You are too sensitive. You think too much. You always have to be different. Why can't you just be normal? Those sentences were delivered with the confidence of people who believed they were helping you. And the tragedy is that they believed it. They were not lying when they said it. They were passing on the armor of their own survival. To navigate the world they had built, sensitivity was a liability. Depth was dangerous. Difference was costly. So they handed you the tool that had kept them small and called it wisdom. They offered you the cage and called it a gift, and for a season you carried it. You wore the label they gave you like a garment you were not allowed to remove. But labels assigned by wounded people are not diagnoses, they are confessions. When someone tells you that you are too much, they are confessing that they are not enough capacity, not enough healing, not enough spiritual spaciousness to hold what you carry. As I teach deeply in the material, The 3 Keys to a Prosperous Life, I left the link for you in the pinned comment. This pain is not evidence that something is wrong with you. It is evidence that you were placed in an environment several sizes too small for the soul you were given. The spirit of rejection that has followed you from that childhood kitchen into your adult relationships is one of the oldest and most sophisticated principalities in operation. It does not announce itself. It plants seeds so early that by the time you are old enough to trace the roots, the tree is enormous and its branches have extended into every significant relationship you have ever attempted. You meet someone new and something in you is already calculating the timeline of their abandonment. You enter love already half exited, 1 foot out of the door, because the evidence of your early years taught you that staying too long and too fully always ends in the same way. So you became careful. You became measured. You kept a version of yourself in reserve. The real version, the deep one, the one that knows things and feels everything, because you learned that when you handed that version to people, they gave it back damaged. That guardedness was not a character flaw. It was a reasonable response to an unreasonable amount of early loss. But I need you to understand that the spirit using your history against you is not interested in your protection. It is interested in your isolation. Isolation is how it disarms you. Because the chosen one in isolation cannot deploy the gift. The prophet who never speaks has not protected himself. He has only silenced the word. The warrior who never re-enters the field because the last battle left scars is not being cautious. He is being held, and the enemy is patient with this particular strategy because he does not need to defeat you openly. He only needs to keep you far enough from your assignment that the window of your maximum impact closes before you find the courage to walk through it. He uses your wounds as walls. He uses your history as a horizon. He frames the evidence of your past to argue the impossibility of your future. Every person who left, every door that closed, every midnight where you asked God if this silence was permanent, all of it becomes ammunition in the campaign to convince you that the isolation is the sentence, not the schooling. But Moses did not waste the wilderness. He learned the landscape that would one day become the road of Israel's liberation. He learned to hear the voice of God in the quiet because there was no noise of Egypt left to compete with it. David did not waste the fields. He learned the character of God in the dark hills, under the open sky, fighting the lion and the bear with no audience and no recognition and no record of the victory except the one God kept. The wilderness is the curriculum for the assignment, And I need to say this with the full weight it deserves. Every single moment you spent in the isolation you did not choose, every season where the phone stopped ringing and the invitations stopped arriving, and the circle that once surrounded you slowly dissolved, was a classroom. You were being taught at a level that no formal institution could deliver. You were being prepared in secret for a deployment that will be anything but secret. The anxiety that has lived in your chest for as long as you can remember is not simply a clinical artifact of unprocessed trauma, though the trauma is real and the body's memory of it is real. There is a dimension to the anxiety that medicine alone cannot address, because the root reaches below the biological floor into the spiritual substrate. The enemy understands the architecture of your assignment. He knows that the command center of your mission is your mind, your capacity to perceive, to believe, to decree, to stand in faith when the natural evidence contradicts the divine promise. So he has targeted your mind with a particular ferocity that is proportionate to the threat your awakened, healed, and fully operational mind represents to his kingdom. The depression that settled on you in certain seasons was not just chemical. It was a siege. The waves of dread that arrived before every breakthrough were not coincidental. They were coordinated. He sends the heaviest weather right before the harvest, because if he can convince you to give up in the final hour, he wins without ever having to fight you at your full strength. The voice that whispered you were better off gone. I need to confront that directly, because for some of you, that whisper was loud enough to sound like your own thought. It was not your thought. It carried your voice only because it had lived inside your head long enough to learn your accent. That is the thief. That is the one who comes to steal, kill, and destroy, operating through the very neurological pathways that were most damaged by the early wounds. He is a counterfeiter. He has no original material. He can only weaponize what was already broken. And the fact that he invested that level of effort into silencing you before you found your voice is the most devastating evidence yet of how significant that voice is. You do not shoot artillery at an empty field. The magnitude of the assault is the magnitude of the threat. You are still here. Hear that again. After every coordinated effort to erase you, from the childhood that tried to convince you that you were fundamentally flawed, to the relationships that reinforced the verdict, to the spiritual warfare that targeted your mind in the dark, you are still here. That is not survival. That is prophecy fulfilling itself in real time. There is something sacred that happens in the soul when it finally stops trying to explain itself to rooms that were never designed to receive the explanation. You have spent years in the exhausting labor of justification, trying to prove to people who had already decided that you were worth understanding, worth staying for, worth the inconvenience of loving fully. That labor is not yours to carry anymore. The people who required you to justify your existence were not assigned to your future. They were assigned to your history, and history in the kingdom economy is raw material, not a permanent address. God did not build you for the approval of people who could not handle your light at full brightness. He built you for the purpose that the light was designed to serve. And that purpose does not require their endorsement. It never did. The departure of certain people from your life was not abandonment. I know it felt like abandonment. I know there were nights when the silence left by their leaving was so loud that you filled it with the only conclusion your wounded self could reach: that you had been weighed and found wanting again by someone you trusted again. But God operates in a dimension your pain does not have access to in the moment of the loss. He saw what was on the other side of that person if they stayed. He saw the slow leak they would have created in the hull of your calling. He saw the ceiling they would have installed over your growth. He saw how your hunger for their approval would have become the chain that kept you circling the same small ground for the rest of your earthly assignment. So he removed them, not cruelly, not carelessly, surgically. The way a physician removes what is compromising the healing of the body, not to punish the patient, but to protect the life. Every closed door had a snake behind it. I want you to receive that sentence not as a cliché, but as a literal spiritual reality. The opportunity that collapsed at the last moment. The relationship that ended before it became what you had hoped. The position you were passed over for. The community that rejected your presence. On the other side of each of those doors, something waited that would have cost you more than you would have known how to pay. God's protection is not always loud. It does not always arrive with explanation. Sometimes it arrives as silence where you expected an answer. Sometimes it arrives as a door that closes so firmly that no amount of knocking reopens it. That firmness is not rejection from heaven. That firmness is the hand of a Father who can see what you cannot see from where you are standing, and who loves you enough to let you be hurt by the closing because the alternative was far worse. But there is a danger on the other side of the deliverance that I have to name with absolute clarity. The danger is the backward glance. Lot's wife was not destroyed by the fire. She was not destroyed by the city she left. She was destroyed by the decision to look back at the thing God had already declared finished. She had been carried out. The escape was real. The new direction was clear and open in front of her. But she turned, and in the turning, she revealed that her body had left the old city while her heart had never released it. The pillar of salt is not a punishment for nostalgia. It is a portrait of what happens to destiny when it is held in suspension between the old thing and the new thing, when the soul refuses to make the complete crossing, when the foot moves forward, but the gaze stays fixed on the burning structure of the former season. You have been led out of more than one burning city in this lifetime. The question that stands before you now is whether you will complete the crossing. The old approval, the approval of the family that never truly saw you, the friends who loved the version of you they were comfortable with, the relationships that required you to be smaller in exchange for their presence. That approval is a burning city. It feels like warmth because it was once the only warmth available to you. But it is built on a foundation of your diminishment, and God has called you beyond its walls. Every time you turn back toward it, you freeze. Not metaphorically. The soul actually suspends its forward motion when it re-engages with the old gravitational field. The longing for the people who hurt you to one day acknowledge that you were worth more than they gave you. That longing is the hand of the enemy holding your ankle. Bless them. Release them completely. The acknowledgement you are waiting for from the past is already being prepared for your future by different hands in a different land. The solitude that once felt like punishment is being reframed right now in the economy of your spirit. You are not alone because you are unloved. You are alone because God is doing something in you that requires the quiet. There is a specific kind of formation that can only happen in the absence of noise. The kind of noise that other people's needs and expectations and opinions generate in the interior of a sensitive, permeable soul like yours. In the silence, you have been learning the sound of your own voice beneath all the voices that were layered over it. In the isolation, you have been finding the edges of your own thought, independent of the framework given to you by people who needed you to think within certain boundaries. The solitude is the womb of the new self. And wombs, by design, are dark and quiet and surrounded by a life that is not yet visible to the outside world. You are not waiting to become someone. You already are someone. The becoming is already complete at the level of divine designation. What you are walking through now is the revealing, the unveiling, the moment when what was formed in the secret place begins to step into the open field of its purpose. And yes, the stepping out will feel terrifying in ways that the hiding never did, because exposure carries risk in a way that invisibility does not. But the treasure was not given to you to be hidden. The gift was not placed in you to be kept for your private comfort. The wound you carry, the wound of having been unseen, of having been silenced, of having been pressed on every side without a witness to your pain, that wound healed becomes the most precise instrument of ministry in existence. You can reach into the chest of someone who has never told anyone about their loneliness and pull out the exact grief they are carrying because you have been in that chest before. You know the geography of that particular darkness. The new tribe is being assembled, not recruited, assembled just the way God assembles things, according to a design that pre-existed the materials themselves. The people who are meant to stand beside you in this next season are already in motion toward you. They have been shaped by some of the same fires. They carry marks that will recognize your marks. They are not coming to need you in the way the old connections needed you, emptying you, drawing from you, consuming the output of your anointing without ever contributing to its replenishment. They are coming to stand with you, to run alongside you, to speak the language that your spirit has been speaking alone in rooms that had no one else fluent in it. The loneliness is not your permanent condition. It is the last chapter of the old season and the white space before the first sentence of the one that is beginning right now. Release the old names they gave you. Release the labels that became the bars of the cage you tried to live inside for the sake of belonging somewhere, even if the somewhere was built on your smallness. You are not too sensitive. You are supernaturally perceptive. You are not too much. You are exactly enough. And what has found you too much was too little. You are not broken in some fundamental way that requires decades of apology and correction. You are a chosen vessel in the final stages of preparation, and the God who called you is the same God who prepares what he calls. He does not call the equipped. He equips the called. And the equipment he is fitting you with right now has been forged in the precise furnace of every experience that tried to tell you that you would never amount to anything, that you were too different, that the loneliness was a verdict rather than a vestibule. You are still here. The declaration has to land in you like an anchor being set in the deepest part of your understanding. After everything, after the childhood that pressed its thumb against the tender place of your spirit without mercy, after the family table where your real self ate alone in the crowd, after the shower where the only witness to your grief was the water, after the relationships that confirmed your worst fear and then retracted with no explanation, after the dark nights of the soul where the enemy pressed his full weight against the door of your mind, you are still here. That is not nothing. That is the signature of God on the outcome of your life, written forward from eternity into the present moment of your survival. The seal that has been on your life since before the foundations of the world is not theoretical. It is not a comfort offered to quiet the pain. It